This week on the Tiara Talk Show, we welcome Puppeteer Jeff Conover to the show. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Tammy.
I'm glad we get to talk because we've had a couple people who've worked on Sing Me a Story with Belle, which was a Disney Channel series way back in the day, and I grew up with it. And we've had a couple people on the show, but never anybody who was a true puppeteer live on set.
Yeah, there were just a couple of us.
I guess that's one thing that you don't really find in kids shows nowadays, but I'm very blessed I was lucky in a time period where that was something that, was still done because it's just so cool. So thank you for being on the show today.
Yeah, of course. It's my pleasure. Yeah, it's right. It was right toward the end of the golden years of puppetry on the Disney Channel that or at least featured puppetry. There were all sorts of fun shows that were going on in the late 80s, early 90s. And I think the last show that featured puppetry prominently was Bear in the Big Blue House.
When did you start doing puppetry? Was this something that was later in life, or as a kid, would you create puppets?
Well, yeah, I grew up during the age of Sesame Street, in the early 70s. I still have my original vinyl album from that first season. I was probably, at the time when Sesame Street started, I was probably 4 years old, something like that. And so I always enjoyed puppetry, and then, skipping forward into my middle school years, that was right during the beginning of the Muppet Show, and I was just enamored by the Muppet Show and loved it so much. And just, I have to say that was probably one of the biggest influences of my life was Muppet Show. And my best friend across the street, Jeff Conover, who ironically ended up being a puppeteer along with me on Sing Me a Story with Belle. We used to build puppets and put on these puppet shows for the neighborhood, and we used to tour around and do summer school programs and do shows, and then of course once we got into high school, we were both of our interests changed, and you never think as a kid, especially, even though you're really interested in it, that you can make a career out of it. But I was more into music and sports, and so my focus changed once I got into high school, and it wasn't until I started at Disney in 1989 that I picked it back up, because maybe I'd say 4 or 5 months into working at Disney, right towards the end of 1989, in the beginning of 90, Jim Henson all of a sudden started showing up on property, and was actually in our green room on a couple of occasions, and I was able to meet him, and that was my big career change. I was at Disney after I graduated college just on a whim. It was sort of a fun job to have. It was one of those things I always wanted to do. And I figured, well, I'm going to go have some fun at Disney, and then I will go get a real job somewhere. And that was all sidetracked after meeting Jim. And he was incredibly nice to, a young man who he didn't know from Adam. And, in my mind, this was career change. I'm going to work for the Muppets, and Jim's moving down to Orlando, and all sorts of production's going to be happening down there. And so I got to talk to him on a couple of occasions and expressed my interest. And of course, being the man that he was always very supportive and said, well, we'd love to have you. And, this is who you need to talk to. And so that was my reintroduction, at least from a perspective of being interested in puppetry again, after meeting Jim in 1990. And then, of course, I guess it was May, 5 months later, he passed away. And but I still retained the interest. Walt Disney World started getting into puppetry and a lot of their live shows. There was a show called the Disney Crew that toured around to schools, and it was a puppet show, and I worked on that. And then in 1991, we started production on The Voyage of the Little Mermaid over at Disney MGM Studios. And I was really the only person, one of 2 or 3 people in that cast that had any prior puppetry experience. And that's kind of how my career started as not just a puppeteer, but as the puppet expert for the Walt Disney Company back when we kicked off Voyage of the Little Mermaid. So that's sort of a long-winded answer to a short question, but that's kind of my background in a nutshell.
Really quickly, just to go back to what you had said before, what type of jobs did you have before you started working with the puppetry in the theme parks?
Well, I was in entertainment. Well, I actually started at Disney, as I say, in '89. I gave tours at the Backstage Studio Tour.
Oh,
and I started
wow.
in June of '89, and I believe the studios opened up in I can't remember, April or May, but it was still very much a soft open type of situation. The script changed sometimes daily, almost every week for sure, where they were trying to figure out, did they want this to be sort of a Jungle Cruise sort of experience? Did they want it to be more informative? And they experimented a lot. And, there was a lot of us who came from production backgrounds. My background in college was I wanted to make commercials. So I got into broadcasting and writing and things like that. So, and everyone that really worked at the Backstage Studio Tour, I'd say 80 to 90% of the cast that worked there all were from either LA or New York or had a previous production background. And everybody sort of migrated to Orlando when the studios opened up, because this was supposed to be, Hollywood East, right? Mm-hmm, and so you had a lot of people working there who weren't your average, what I would say your average Disney employee that were, loaded with pixie dust. And I mean, everyone loved Disney, of course, but they had a sort of a different maybe mindset or demeanor, very creative, somewhat cynical. And with the constant script changes, people just started to make it their own. And you had people that were giving tours that were, they'd provide the information that was in the script, but then they'd embellish quite a bit with some comedy. And it was so much fun. That
was prime. That was like the prime time to be there at the studios, right?
It was a blast, it was 5 or 6 months of a lot of fun and met some really great people. But the money wasn't great. And I was commuting actually from Clearwater every day. And I just figured, well, I'm a college graduate here. I've got a degree. I need to actually get a job that pays. I've got to start a career. So I was getting ready to leave. And then I met some people just by happenstance that worked in the entertainment department. And they encouraged me to audition for the entertainment department, which is what I did, and got into the entertainment department and was friends with many of the characters in the entertainment department there at the studios. And I think there were maybe 20 performers at the time. It was a very small cast of performers at Disney MGM Studios. And
wow. And you mean friends with specific characters?
Exactly.
Which, could we ask what friends they are?
Well, of course, I was big friends with Pluto and big friends with Eeyore. They were my 2 go-to characters that I just loved hanging out with the most. And, I did that. I transferred into the entertainment department full-time come January 1st of 1990. And as I said earlier, a couple months later, all of a sudden, there's Jim Henson.
So Jim Henson was one of those big notable individuals that you got to meet. I want to come back to that in a second, but 2 more questions about the Backlot Tour. Number 1, did you get to give a tour to any celebrities?
I'm trying to remember. I met a lot of celebrities during my time there in the late, 89 and the early 90s, because there was the Star of the Day program where they would do a cavalcade down the street. The star would sit on the back of a convertible, and they'd drive to the Hollywood Theater, put their hands in cement, and there was the whole thing. And so, of course, we got to meet and talk with them backstage. So, but I don't remember giving tours to any celebrities when I was doing the backstage studio tour. Now, I did the driving portion of that. So I gave the tour, and then part of the rotation was after you gave the tour, then you drove the shuttle. And then after you drove the shuttle, then you went out front and you were greeting. And then from that, you went and you helped load guests onto the shuttle. And it just rotated like that throughout the day. I did not do the walking tour. At that point, they had already split it up. So you were either walking tour cast or you were doing the shuttle part of it. So I was driving through Catastrophe Canyon, God knows how many times a day. But that whole time, I swear, it's quite a blur. Honestly, I don't remember a lot from the shuttle tour, other than, and this is obviously selective memory, but I remember working. This was the first time I had worked on Christmas morning. First time I had never been with my family on Christmas morning. I was there at like 7 a.m. and we had to wipe down the shuttles because they'd always get wet overnight. And I took out the very first tour on Christmas morning, and the guests were running through the park, running to get on these shuttles, and I couldn't believe how many people had showed up on Christmas morning at Walt Disney World. I was like, why aren't people at home? I don't understand this. I mean, the place was packed. And that's one of the memories that really sticks out in my head. And then, of course, spending lots of time down Residential Street and staring at all the houses, and of course the Golden Girls house and things like that. Those are the big memories for me, but I don't remember giving any tours to celebrities per se.
What about one of your favorite props or costumes that was originally featured in the attraction? Because this just fascinates me, because I was going back through some videos online of other people's, tours that they've been on. Yeah. And I found a video where they had the outfits of the Dick Tracy characters. Yeah. And D23 just released photos of those exact costumes that are in storage. It's just crazy. So what was one of your favorites to see or mention during the tour?
I think the one that always fascinated me the most was the Mary Poppins Jolly Holiday dress. That was in there, and that was a staple of the tour. They did change out a lot of the costumes. Some of those props, it was mostly in the boneyard there, scenic pieces. There was the big trolley, which was a converted bus from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and then they had the pod from Tron back there, which I thought was really cool. But I think driving past the Mary Poppins dress from Jolly Holiday was the thing that I just couldn't believe it was sitting in there. And I started to question whether or not it was the actual dress. And God knows, who knows if it really was, because I just couldn't believe that it would be sitting in there and not in the archives out in Burbank. But, nevertheless, that was my favorite thing. It never got old seeing that. I just couldn't believe it was sitting there. And I, stared at that thing daily for 6 months. It's hard for me, I tell you, Tammy, for years, the Disney MGM Studios, that's kind of where I grew up. Those were, from my 20s all the way into my 30s, I spent all my time there. And it was hard for me as it started to evolve and change, especially once the Backstage Studio Tour was removed. I had a really tough time, and when they brought in Lights, Motor, Action, it was basically, I was always saying it was like a ghost of its former self. You could see elements of what used to be there. And, one of the areas that I would always walk through to get backstage where I would park was right through where the offices were for the Backstage Studio tour.
Yes.
And, and to see the old loading dock and all that stuff that used to be there, but it wasn't utilized anymore. It just didn't sit well. I'm too nostalgic for my own good, I think. That I definitely know about myself, but walking through the sort of I don't know, it's like a time capsule, I guess you could say. It always just kind of freaked me out and made me feel kind of weird. And so I kind of stopped going there even as a guest, just because,
it wasn't what it was.
Remember when the Christmas tree used to be in front of the Chinese theater, and they had this really cool train going around it, and it was a very sort of retro feel that they continued on, that old 1940s Hollywood thing. And once they put the Sorcerer's Apprentice hat there, that got rid of the tree, and things continued to happen year after year that made it less and less what it used to be. Which is, fine, and it. I think for the most part, it all heads in the right direction, and this is what Disney's all about, is evolving and changing. But those of us that are super nostalgic and grew up with certain things, it's hard to let go.
Sing Me a Story with Belle. Was this filmed on the backlot at MGM, or was this somewhere else?
Yeah, we did 2 seasons of that. The first season we actually shot in the sound stages there at Disney MGM Studios, and they were always looking for production to go into those sound stages or anywhere in the backlot, because it just made the backlot tour, the Backstage Studio tour, that much more interesting. And it was proof that this was a working film and television studio. So yeah, we filmed that first season there. And of course, the entire time we were filming, we had, if you remember the walking tour, you would walk through those sound stages kind of on almost like a catwalk, looking down at the productions that were happening down in those sound stages. And so we would be shooting, and you could look up and see, guests all day long peering down and watching what we were doing. And that was really cool.
What year did that start? Was it like 96 or 97?
I want to say 95.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I think that first season was 1995. And I would have to go back and check that, but I'm pretty sure. And then we did the second season, I believe, in 90, like the next year, like 1996.
Yeah, that set was amazing.
Oh, I know. That was Jimbo Marshall, who's no longer with us. He was an amazing designer, and that was his baby. And I had never personally, I had done commercials and things like that before, and I had done TV shows, but never something at this scale. And the sets were always a little smaller. You could see that they were a little under budget. This was a multi-million-dollar production, and it looked like it. I mean, the set, Jimbo did an amazing job, and that the entire team, Mark Dillon, I believe, was the guy's name that did the scenic dressing and props. These guys were just really amazing, and they were all Orlando based, which made me proud that we had that level of talent in Orlando. But yeah, it was a gorgeous set, and it was lit beautifully. They did a nice job.
It surprises me that there really isn't a lot of information about the show online. Like, a lot of people posted the videos that I sent to you of the show, of some episodes. And the reason I found it was not through Disney Channel. They had a VHS tape release of the 3 princesses. Do you remember this? Jasmine, Ariel, and Belle. It confuses me because, apparently from the the information I found, Lindsay, who played Belle, would actually tour around the United States as her character to encourage children to read.
There was a lot of support from the channel behind that show at the time. Like you, I remember seeing the VHS tapes in stores. Believe it or not, it must still be playing somewhere, because I still randomly will receive a residual check for that show for like 5 cents or something like that. The fact that's
hilarious.
Still happening cracks me up. And, Disney Channel itself, it's spawned off. You've got Disney Channel, Disney Junior, and, it's just evolved so many times over the years. It's just one of those things that's lost with history. It'll be interesting to see if it ever sees the light of day, maybe on Disney Plus or something. Who knows?
That would be wonderful, because for listeners who have never seen the show, please type in the title on YouTube. There are a couple of episodes on there, but the structure of the show basically is that Belle has her bookshop now in the village, and she has children that stop by, and there is a problem at the beginning of the episode, and to resolve the problem, they read some books, which turn out to be some of the older cartoons that used to be made usually around the time that Walt Disney was still alive. So they were kind of bringing those back into the consciousness of younger children, which was great. But then they would talk about the lessons learned from these cartoons. And at the very end, they would always feature, I think, about like 2 to 3 books that were real books that children could go to their library and go ahead and read. It was a wonderful show to encourage children to read.
Yeah, it was. I think, Patrick Davidson, who was the producer on that show, and I think he wrote many of the episodes as well. That was his brainchild, and it was very clever, really. I mean, Disney Channel at the time really liked, not only was the Beauty and the Beast property very popular at the time, and of course utilizing Belle as your storyteller, but the fact that they were able to fold in some of this more, the older shorts and cartoons that, from the 30s and 40s, to help lend a visual to the storytelling. And there was always an original song as part of that as well, which was really great. It was a great little formula, and Patrick, he was really smart when he put that together.
I think it would be great for them to bring it back as some type of structure, because encouraging children to read is such an important part. It really opens minds and gives them more information. And I always loved that about the show. And
right.
How would you go through a day? Like, how was the day scheduled or an episode scheduled? Was it like something that had to be completed within a week per episode, or?
That part of it is kind of a blur. I remember we would shoot an entire season. We probably shot a whole season in like 2 or 3 weeks time. And so we would typically go through and do an entire episode. If I remember correctly, we would do an episode per day. And the only thing that was shot out of order and sort of let's do an entire season's worth of shooting at 11 o'clock at night was when we did Lewis and Carol, the Little Bookworms. We would do all of that stuff over the course of 1 or 2 evenings for the entire run of a season. And I remember clearly right toward the end of the shooting season for season 1 in particular, we were there I think we started shooting a season's worth of Lewis and Carol content at like 11 o'clock at night. And the reason I know it was 11 o'clock at night is I was telling you earlier that I found a lot of my home video from behind the scenes when we were shooting this show. And one of the guys that was shooting was using my video camera. he says, I'm going to put the time on here so we have proof we were working here at 11 o'clock at night. But we went from 11 to like 2 in the morning shooting all of this Lewis and Carroll content, and then come in the next morning and continue shooting the whole day. You're working with people who are just really great at what they do, at their jobs, at their disciplines. And, you start to, you respect them immediately. As like with Jimbo, all you got to do is walk into that stage and go, oh my God, look at this set. And, I remember telling him, I'm like, Jimbo, you're a genius. This is amazing. And he was the sweetest guy and super humble and one of the funniest guys I've ever met. And, and it just went down the line. Everyone was like that. It was just so much fun.
One of the things I do want to mention is, so with the puppeteering, there are a couple characters in the show that are just mainly puppets. So we got Lewis and Carroll, the bookworms. We have Big Book, who kind of helps Belle tell the story usually. And then Harmony, the cat, who usually is sitting by the window seat. And I believe you got to work with Harmony. Were you also the voice, or were you just working on her movements? Yeah,
I did. And it's kind of embarrassing because, when we started this, I did the harmonies, I did the puppetry for Harmony, and I did the voice. And it sort of evolved over time. But, the voice I was doing for Harmony was not supposed to be her voice. They were going to dub it later. And so I just, made up some random voice that was like a female, Carl from Caddyshack. And I think what ended up happening is, a lot of the fun you end up having and a lot of the development of a character over time happens not while you're shooting, but in between takes. And I think a lot of the fun we were having with Harmony and Harmony's personality, she was, I kind of made her quite edgy and sassy in between takes, within, good taste, of course, because we had kids everywhere. But, I think what ended up happening and why they kept the voices, people just got used to it, and they liked her off-camera personality so much that they just decided to keep it, because it's not a great voice at all. If you listen to the audio quality of it as well, the audio of it wasn't great because it was essentially a scratch track for at least that entire first season. It was just a scratch track as far as they were concerned. So there was a lot of weird echoing. I was either in a big cavernous area underneath that little window seat at that bay window up at the top there of the set, or I was inside of a footlocker next to one of the couches. And these were just big cavernous areas, and we did muffle those areas. We put lots of material and egg crate foam in there just to keep the sound from bleeding onto the set. But, the quality of it isn't good at all. And I have to admit, as I say, I'm embarrassed by by that voice, but it is what it is.
It's so cute.
And, her character did evolve, and I did. Once we got into the second season, I was like, all right, well, I guess I'm going to have to really create something a little bit better here. And then the audio quality was a little bit better, but it certainly probably wasn't, the voice I would have chosen, because it is a female character. I'm not good at falsetto voices. And, it was a rough go, quite honestly, because, we have a saying in puppetry: if you're comfortable performing, then you're doing it wrong. And that was the case. Every position I was in performing Harmony was just awful. I mean, your hand went into that puppet kind of in her stomach area, So which immediately puts your entire forearm into her body before your hand even gets up into her head. So your forearm is horizontal, if you can picture this. So you're coming up into the puppet, you immediately bend your elbow 90 degrees, so your forearm is horizontal, and then your hand at the wrist does another 90-degree turn to get it up in position into the head. Now, normally when you're doing a puppet, the head and body, it's all vertical, right? It's straight up and down, and it's in line with your wrist is in line with your forearm and all of that stuff, and it's a lot easier to do. But the position I was in, regardless of where I was hidden, was just an awful position. And that puppet was very heavy. We had a servo motor in there, and it was just being in that position and then holding the weight of the puppet. You had very limited mobility of the head. So when you're trying to focus on other actors on the set that you're interacting with and acting with, you couldn't. Many times you just couldn't get the eye focus to whoever it was you're looking at and talking to, and you're fighting the puppet and the position you're in, and then the limited mobility of the thing and the weight of it. It was a tough go. And then you're trying to do the voice at the same time, and you're sweating, and but it was. I wouldn't have traded it. It was a blast. We had so many laughs. Again, as soon as the camera stopped, even though I was in pain, you couldn't stop. You couldn't stop performing because I was kind of in charge of keeping the kids laughing, keeping the crew laughing. And as I said earlier, that's kind of how her character was developed, really, was between takes.
She reminds me of a kid's version of Miss Piggy because she's so sassy, and I love it. Yeah. So I love it.
Should've
I love it. So cute.
Between takes, Tammy. I loved it.
Can you do a little line for us?
Oh my God. I tried to do something last night because my daughter, who is 7, has never seen the show. She saw it last night. I pulled some up on YouTube and I said, Charlotte, come here, take a look at this. And she was laughing. And of course she said, Daddy, do the voice. I'm like, I don't know if I can do that voice because, I'm not a good falsetto person to begin with, but I've aged, 25 years probably since then. So I don't have the vocal chops to pull it off anymore, but I'll try it.
Hello, Tammy. This is Harmony the cat. It's nice to see you and be on your show.
See, I can't really do it.
I love it. Oh my gosh. It's wonderful flashbacks for me.
I'm part of your childhood.
Forever, Harmony. Forever.
That's right. I'm glad I was there.
Me too. Oh my God. That's so cool. Oh gosh. I
had
really
a good time. The company that built those puppets, Animax, and here's something that was always wrong in the titles. Animax, I don't remember them getting a shout out on that, but my friend Chuck Fawcett, who owns Animax Designs, he built all those puppets, and he and I did the first, I think, 3 episodes together. And he was doing the eyes on Harmony. Now, eventually I ended up taking over the eye movement on Harmony just because it's easier as a performer if you're in charge of your eye blinks, right?
Yeah.
But those eyes were operated off a radio control unit, off an RC unit. And so for the first probably half of that first season, a lot of those shows, the second puppeteer was doing Harmony's eye blinks. And there's a definite disconnect between my movements and then the eye blinks. And so once I got comfortable in there and I was starting to see that there was a bit of a disconnect going on, I took over the eye blinks myself. But, Chuck and I were the 2 puppeteers on that show for the first, like I say, maybe 3 episodes. And so Chuck would do the eyes for Harmony when I was doing Harmony. He would then do Big Book. He would do Big Book's eyes, and sometimes he would do Big Book's eyes and mouth movement. And then, of course, when we did all of the Lewis and Carol bookworm stuff, he was doing Carol and I was doing Lewis. And then Chuck, of course, has a company to run, so he couldn't stay and do an entire 2 or 3 weeks of shooting, so he left. And my friend, who I mentioned earlier, that we used to do puppet shows as little kids, he came in, and he performed Big Book and did Carol in a lot of the episodes. But Chuck still gets credit for all of those episodes as a puppeteer. But he only did maybe half of them of that first season. And then Jeff Domke came in. His name's Jeff Domke, and he actually works at the Center for Puppetry Arts. He's still very into puppetry. He does all of their outreach and education programming for them.
What do you think has happened to the puppets today? Do you think they still are around?
If I remember correctly, I think Harmony went to Patrick Davidson. I know that she lived at the Animax offices for a while, but I think she ended up going over to Patrick. I think, and I could be wrong about that. I know Animax was storing a lot of that stuff for Patrick for a while, but Harmony was old school puppet. She was
so
foam.
pretty.
Yeah, she was foam and fur. So at this point, if she is still around somewhere, I think the foam is by now definitely turned to toast. What we call toast, it just disintegrates. I mean, it turns into dust. So if no one's touching it, she might still be there as a 3-dimensional form. But there's also a really good chance that she may have completely collapsed under the weight of her fur and is, nothing but a former, a 3-dimensional form of her former self.
Well, what have you been up to recently working for Disney and puppeteering, especially during all of this prior to all the craziness? What have you been up to?
Well, when I was working at Walt Disney World Resort, I was responsible for auditioning. I created sort of what an audition looked like for puppeteers. I created a training program and essentially just created a role for myself over the years on how we train puppetry, how we train puppeteers, how we look for puppeteers. Because, there aren't a lot of puppeteers out there, waiting and looking for a job. The number of performers we need at our parks and resorts, if we've got puppetry, is immense. And you're not going to find people who are trained puppeteers just to come in off the street and start working at the show. So, we have to find people who just have the aptitude and want to learn puppetry and have an interest in it. And then we can train them the skills that it takes to become a puppeteer. So I created that program and did that probably from about 1991, all the way through 2003. And then I moved over into another area of our company. I left the sort of the Walt Disney World Resort per se and moved over into an area called Character Programs and Development. And Character Programs and Development is responsible for all character design and costume design. They do all of that, and it is what it sounds like. They do all of the training materials for the characters. They do all of the costume designs. And I moved over there in 2003 and became a designer over there and was responsible for the design and development and sort of the creative direction of what the next generation of our talking characters would be. So I created all of the articulated characters and have done that with Character Programs and Development since 2003. And we got absorbed into Walt Disney Imagineering back in 2009. So we're now part of, since 2009, part of Imagineering. So, my scope is a global scope, so I'm responsible for any live, interactive, articulated character or puppet that ends up in our parks around the world. So if it's a puppet, if it has any type of animated features to it, I'm responsible for really the creative direction and how that is designed and developed.
And the cruise ships too.
And cruise ships, yeah. And I'd say cruise ships are probably, between all of our ships, and we've got 3 more on the way. Our parks are 3 parks in Asia, and of course the one in France, and then our 2 domestic. There's puppetry all over the world. So to say that I travel a lot is a massive understatement. So I'm constantly on the road, installing shows and puppetry content all over the world and on the ships. And I'm the only guy that does what I do, which I love, because I'm a bit of a control freak. So I'm able to have the control that I like to have over what these things look like and how they operate, how they're manipulated, how they're performed. And, we get to do some really, really great stuff with, fairly decent budgets most of the time. So whatever you can dream up, you're pretty much able to deliver on. You can come up with the weirdest, craziest idea. And we've got so many talented people that work in our area and at Disney, other designers, engineers, that, you ask a question, what if, or can we? And they say, yeah, I think we can do that. And, you're constantly sort of pushing the envelope. And I think what we do in terms of puppetry and performance, I don't know that anyone is doing as much as we're doing, and I'd like to think that we do it better than anybody else. I'm very proud of our work, and our performers are, amazing. They love what they do, and I'm a lucky guy to be able to do what I do. And I'll be glad when all of this pandemic stuff is over, so we can get back to it, because we've got some really great stuff in the pipeline that we've had to put a hold on, sadly, because of the pandemic.
You're continuing that ball and keeping it rolling, and I love it. So
yeah, thank you.
It's great. Well, I have 3 Disney themed questions I ask each of my guests before we end our show. So let's start with the Donald one, which is, as a child, what Disney film was one of your favorites to see in the movie theater?
In the movie theater, I don't know if I could call it my favorite, but the one I was most affected by was Bambi. I think a lot of people share that. I think my favorite as a kid, it's got to be the original Herbie movie.
And our goofy question, what Disney character do you think would be your best friend if you met them in person?
I don't know. I love Coco. I think that is one of our finest films. I just love that movie. It's so emotional, and any character from that film, from Miguel's family, I could definitely see being besties with.
And then finally, our Mickey question. If I asked you to name any Disney song at this very moment, what immediately comes to mind?
Probably Remember Me from Coco. I will start tearing up. I'm actually tearing up thinking about that song.
Well, I can't thank you enough. This has been an interview in the making for a couple of years now, and I really appreciate you being so sweet. I know. We were trying to see if we could do a reunion with the rest of the cast, so maybe something might come together, and you'll be able to show some of those really cool behind-the-scenes clips. You never know.
You never know. I've got them. So it would be nice to find some of the gang from the show and see what they're up to.
We'll keep our feelers out, and
All right.
hopefully something special. But we're going to go back to Belle's bookshop and find a book to read for the rest of lockdown.
I said, see you later.